David, I really did appreciate the Jimmy Stewart the propaganda campaign. Corporations are people. They're people, my friends. Corporations is a big business. It's like, oh, it's on May and Uncle Stu.
I mean, you can't believe it. It's really hard to believe. Like when you listen to it now, you're like, wow, like this is so deranged. But it was probably incredibly effective. I mean, clearly it was incredibly effective.
Well, when you got actors like, you got propaganda films with Jimmy Stewart at them, you got no complaints. But David, I think the very interesting tell here is that there was like this public education campaign centered around teaching Americans about not the American political system or our history or the features of our democracy. It was about the American economic system or the American system. And I think that's very telling. And like in the Jimmy Stewart clip, there's like man on the street interviews and they talk to some woman. They're like, do you know what makes the American economic system work? And she's like, oh, I don't know much about economics. Like the obvious answer being, I don't know, the people who work for it. Like that's kind of what makes the economy work. But no, it was just all about like that. There's the American economic system that is being attacked by American democracy.
That's
by the American people. But I mean, that second part is left unsaid. But Jimmy Stewart's like, it's government's becoming a monopoly that's getting in the way of our individual spirit in this country.
What do you get for a country that has everything? Well, almost everything. Government bureaucracy is becoming a paternalistic monopoly that is burying us in paperwork and red tape. It stifles initiative. And it erodes the basic self-reliance, which is our American legacy.
And of course, that's being echoed by Ronald Reagan in the political sphere. And I think it's one of those things where you look at it and you think the conservatives understood that they can make arguments, especially in the era of TV, that you can make arguments and they can be really effective if they're arguments that sound logical if you only think about it for 5 seconds. And they all of this propaganda that they start producing in the 70s, in some ways, if you only think about it for 5 seconds, you might be like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. But if you're right, like the way you just said that, Will, which is like, what about the workers? Like that is the American economics. It's not just like a bunch of CEOs sitting around. It's actually the people who actually produce the wealth. Right, but they were relying on a kind of new media environment at the time, the age of television and the like. That they did a shrewd and successful job of banking on people not really thinking about it.
It's like it's that way. You're right. It's that way of talking about politics. That's like, I guess the best word for it would be commonsensical.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
When politicians talk about the budget, like, well, your family knows that if they spend more money than they're taking in, they're going to go in debt. And like, why should the government be any different? It's like, yeah, like on surface value, you're like, oh yeah, you probably shouldn't spend more money than you have. But like that elides the huge reality that a government that can issue its own currency, and that currency is like the global reserve, is not a family on a budget looking to like, oh, are we going to get Cheerios this week or like the Super Aldi off-brand?
Exactly, and I should say this cultural focus is not. Again, we talk about what's natural inevitability. What is actually part of a plan. We found a document, as another example, in which Roger Ailes is making a presentation to a group of corporate executives and their task force about the Powell memo. And his presentation is all about how corporations as advertisers should use their power as advertisers, the leverage they have as advertisers to influence television programming. And what that means is essentially to look, every time it's mentioned that, hey, maybe giant corporate media and all the companies that advertise on corporate media, maybe they influence like what is decided to be covered in the news, and like you get eye rolled, oh, that's just a conspiracy theory. I mean, here in the 1970s, Roger Ailes is literally talking about that, promoting it, suggesting it, and we found other letters in which correspondence about the Powell Memo Task Force. One letter, for instance, the head of CBS is saying he thinks the concerns are valid about the Naderites and the like, and that he's been working to try to get his newsroom and his television company's programming to be more pro-free market. I mean, this sounds like conspiracy theory. It's not conspiracy theory. It was a conspiracy.
My great-great-uncle, Professor Isidore Corey, wrote a famous book on economics 200 years ago. It takes 200 years to read it. Here, hold this. However, if you want to increase your EQ, my suggestion is read this, The American Economic System and Your Part in It. It's free, just like Economics, Pueblo, Colorado, 81009, right? The American Economic System. We should all learn more about it.